We are here live on YouTube, Cali X Boxing 2.0, and I'm joined live by D-Style Boxing, Dragon Style. What's going on this Wednesday, Hump Day, on a big fight week?
Hey, I'm ready. I'm pumped. Let's go. You know what I mean? This is fight week. You know, where we're right there, right in the middle. So, and tomorrow's a round table. So I'm just getting ready to rock, man.
Round table over on D-Style's channel. That should be a big one, and it should be a good one. And the reason we do this exercise here, Days of Future Past, it shows what would happen if one thing went differently. If a fighter got a decision over another fighter. On this fight week, Canelo fight week, we're featuring what if Canelo never existed? What if he never existed? What would the boxing landscape be right now? What would the boxing landscape have been the past 12, 13 years? Who would the face of boxing be? And if you want to break down a little bit what Days of Future Past is and what we're looking at here.
Yeah, for sure. So like you mentioned, right? You change one thing, and it's like just think about a game of blackjack. If you change one aspect of it, you don't go hit one more time, you do it at the wrong time, it changes the whole game. Just like, if you ever play poker, it could change the whole game if just one little thing changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just in life in general. And this goes back to the whole, of course, for those that see it and find it familiar, it's about the X-Men, right? At the fall of the X-Men, they go back in time, since the Sentinels defeated the mutants, so they go back in time and they stop the creation of the Sentinels to begin with, and they go back to the future, and then everything's different, right? The mutants are still alive, everything's different. So we go back and we change one aspect. In this case, Canelo either never took up boxing, never existed, whatever the case is. Okay, this young kid from Mexico just never took up the sport. He was never a thing. So
he's a golfer. What if he just took up golf?
He just took up golf. Yeah.
They had golf. They offered golf, and he took up golf and became a golfer instead because he's a pretty good golfer. So,
or he got run over by a car when he was 5 years old. He could have maybe he saves his sister from a rabid dog, and we have Canelo division. You know what I mean, or something.
Canelo weight instead of Middleweight.
That's right.
So that's what we're dealing with here. And in this case, it's actually a big. We wanted to do it on Canelo fight week, and this is actually a big adjustment. This isn't just a decision here and there. This is a big adjustment. What if Canelo never existed? And the reason we're doing it is it's not on some fanboy stuff. It's not. And by the way, if you think boxing would be in a better state, a more competitive state without Canelo in it, drop it in the comments. We're all ears. We're all ears. All we're doing is
I want to hear everybody's perspective, and those listening on archive, put it in the comment section. And always, we have the other Futures Past if you guys want to check those out as well.
That's right. Days of Future Past. And I'm going to put a folder up on my YouTube page of all the Days of Future Past. I think I've done that already. And I'm going to put this one under that file as well, so everybody can check it out.
Right.
Now, let's first explore the 154-pound division when Canelo was coming up, right? Canelo's...
Sure.
Knocking out Carlos Valdemir, Canelo's fighting Austin Trout. Around this time, Canelo doesn't exist. What would the 154-pound division have looked like if Canelo's not in it from, say, 2009 to 2014?
Just at all, yeah. I think
yeah, go ahead.
Several things are different in my opinion. First of all, I think Austin Trout and Lara, who did eventually fight, by the way, so we already know the outcome of that fight.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would have been a unification fight. That would have been a big unification fight, similar to like we saw recently at 154. I think Lara would have won that fight. I think Lara would have been the king of 154 pounds after that win. For those that don't remember, Lara was the best fighter out of the gym that both Charlos were in. You know what I mean? And I seen sparring footage.
Remember Lara outboxing Paul Williams, and Paul Williams got the decision, right?
He got the decision. So obviously that wouldn't change, but people would know. And obviously I think we already know what would have happened with him and Trout. Trout from my neck of the woods, born El Paso, grew up in Las Cruces, which is literally just 45 minutes away. from the Southwest. I thought Trout is a very underrated fighter, especially for his time. He just ran into what turned out to be a special fighter in Canelo. Like, you know what I mean? And then he ran into like the Charlo brothers, who were pretty good too, right? And then Lara, obviously. So I think Lara would have been there. Mayweather would have not fought Lara. Not because Mayweather's scared of Lara or something, but because there wouldn't be anything really there for Mayweather. Like, I don't think Mayweather wouldn't see Lara as like, oh man, it's a big event. You get what I mean? And I think Lara would rule up until he didn't. Like, I still feel like Jermell would have been the guy to eventually dethrone him, but Lara would have had a reign. Lara would have had a long reign, I believe.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know if you do agree with that. If you think he would have gotten the Rigondeaux treatment, I don't, because Lara actually made for pretty. Outside from the Canelo fight, in this case, Canelo doesn't exist. His fights weren't that bad. I mean, he might have like a trilogy with Angulo. Really, I mean, if you think about it, because Angulo's in the mix. Kirkland's in the mix. I think Lara beats those guys, to be honest with you, but I think they make for very exciting fights. I think he beats Kirkland in a decision. I think he beats Angulo probably in a rematch again, but I think it makes for great fights. I think they do rematch because he knocked down Lara twice, which is hard to believe, but he did. So a lot of those fights still happen. I just think Lara would have been the king of that division, and I think eventually, maybe, and I know you said around 2015, but eventually 2017-ish, Jermell Charlo puts an end to the reign of Lara. I think, and then we still get what we have now with Jermell. I think that's the key element. Mayweather never goes back up. Cotto does not fight Lara, by the way. I still think Cotto moves up and does his thing, so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but there's no Cotto Lara fight. I no offense to your boy Cotto. I don't think Cotto steps in the ring with him. I just don't.
No, I agree with that. I don't think Cotto at 154 at all.
And I have a theory about something Lara would have done, but I'll touch on that because we're not there yet.
Yeah. So you see this here, Lara beats Mayweather 154. I don't think we would have ever found out. Mayweather, besides the Cotto fight, if Canelo's not there, that would have been his lone before, right? I don't think he ever steps back at 154 if Canelo's not there.
Does he fight Andrade? I think Lara does fight. I think he beats Andrade.
Who are you talking about, Lara?
Yes.
Or Mayweather?
No, Andrade, because he's in a mix right there, and I just remembered him. So does Andrade get that fight? Does it open the door for an Andrade to get a fight? Or Jermell? I left Jermell out, but I think it would have been Jermell. I'm just going by what we know today.
Jermell would have eventually dethroned Lara 2016-ish, 2017-ish, but I agree with you. I tend to agree that Lara would have had a long run had Canelo not been there and stopped that. And Canelo with Kirkland, Canelo with Angulo. Those losses, that vicious loss that James Kirkland had to Canelo doesn't happen, right? So a lot of things happen. Amir Khan doesn't get his shot at 154 against Canelo, right? So
never moves up.
Those guys have big paydays there. Lara goes on his big run at 154. And as he goes on his big run at 154, maybe something developed. Maybe Lara moves up to 160 quicker, right? Maybe he moves up to 160. Maybe he just gets tired and moves up to 160 and chases bigger fights. But the fights were there for him at 154 in that division, right? And that's a division historically. It seems like a division in modern history where guys mix it up. So that would have been the case there, and Lara would have went on his run at 154. I tend to agree with you there.
Yeah, like I think that it would have been something similar to this. I think Lara has a big, and I think it's a bigger deal. I think Lara versus Austin Trout is a big unification fight. At least in the boxing world. I don't mean among casuals, but in the boxing world, it's a big deal. We already know what happened there. I think it's the same fight, right? I think Lara boxes Austin Trout. He showed he was a superior boxer, at least in that fight, at least against each other. And then he went on to, I think he would go on to defend against, he would do a rematch with Angulo. I think he would win the rematch against him. I think there's several fighters I believe they would have put him in there with. I think they would have put him in there with like a Victor Ortiz. I think he beats Victor Ortiz because they were trying to put Victor Ortiz at 154. I think beats him. I think he beats. I do think an Andrade fight happens because Lara would be open to a lot of fights because he's not this huge household name, but he would be a defending champion. And I do believe that Lara, especially mid 2015-ish, 16, like before that in a way, I think that Lara beats Andrade all day. I think he beats him competitive, but he beats him. And I think he also, like I think that's where I'm at. Like, and eventually gets either dethroned or moves up. But for to be specific, I think he would get eventually dethroned by Jermell.
Now, 2 comments from Lil Penny that are interesting to me. Do you think Khan versus Brook happens earlier at 147? Because if Khan doesn't get the Canelo fight, then Khan versus Brook should have happened a long time ago. Do you think that fight happens if Khan doesn't step up to 154 and fight Canelo and get obliterated? That's a possibility at 147.
I don't, because I just think Khan always knew what was going to happen in that fight.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I feel about it.
Now, GGG, Lara, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., and Jacobs are the big winners if Canelo never exists. It depends on how you look at it. As far as paydays, not so much. But as far as not losing to Canelo, then yeah, that. But believe me, Gennady Golovkin is more thrilled than anybody that Canelo Alvarez exists.
And we're going to talk about that in a little bit.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. But there's nobody more grateful, although he doesn't show it, that Canelo Alvarez exists. Now let's sort of segue into the middleweight division. 2015-ish. Canelo steps up to middleweight, if you want to call it that. It's not exactly 160, but they fight at a catch weight. I believe the fight was at 155. But steps into the middleweight waters and fights Cotto. What do you think of the whole middleweight run and how the middleweight picture would have changed had Canelo not been in that?
It gets very, very interesting because now, at least in my timeline, remember, I have Lara as a King 154 for a little bit, at least as a unified champion, beating Trout, fighting the Kirklands of the world. I believe an Andrade fight happens. And I think eventually he gets dethroned. And Lara, if you think about it, has always lost in his controversial fights. Like, I think he would have lost in a controversial fight or something, right? And I do believe that Lara would have moved up to 160. I think he would have been a viable name. I don't think Cotto fights Lara. It's got to be honest. I don't think he would see any value in that fight. I think, and another thing is Gennady Golovkin's kind of left out in the cold because I don't think Cotto would have fought Gennady Golovkin either. I just don't. He showed no signs of wanting to do that. So he defeated Martinez, right? I don't think that changes. And then he fought Gil. I think Cotto probably fights guys coming up from 154 or welterweights coming up in weight. That's what I believe happens. But I just don't think he ever fights Gennady Golovkin. If anything, with HBO eventually dying out, Gennady Golovkin would have been forced to either sign with PBC or just kind of sign with DAZN, but nowhere near as lucrative of a deal as he got. I just don't think it would have been. I don't know who Cotto, because Cotto was just hanging around as a lineal champion. I think Cotto just retires. I think Cotto retires, in my opinion.
After the Saddam Ali fight, again, he still gets retired by Saddam Ali.
Well, here's the or. I'm going to catch you off guard with this one. I think Mayweather moves up to fight Cotto at a catchweight in a rematch for the middleweight championship. Instead of doing the Pacquiao fight. I think that's what he does, to be honest with you. Like, if he fought Pacquiao in 2015, I think his plans would have changed, right? And I think Mayweather would have gone for that middleweight belt because you have a small guy. He's already fought before. He's already beat before with the middleweight championship. And I think that Mayweather probably tries to end his career with something like that, to be honest.
Mayweather would have definitely made a move like that. Mayweather would have been, but I think after the Pacquiao fight.
That's the one thing that changes. Like, instead of fighting Canelo, he actually ends up fighting Cotto later on because he wouldn't have to be 2015. He could have fought. Cotto won the belt against Martinez in 2014, right?
Uh-huh.
So Mayweather, there's no Canelo around. There's no. Remember that fight fell in his lap. He had this. They were putting him on the undercard. Okay, he's young. Okay, let's do it. This is a future star. I could beat him now. Okay, that doesn't exist anymore. So what else does he have? Either he does a Pacquiao fight earlier, which maybe both are true, but I do think he ends up fighting Cotto in a rematch for the middleweight championship. And I think he beats Cotto again.
We have a middleweight champion Mayweather in the non-Canelo world.
Yeah,
that's a definite possibility, because I always said I felt like Mayweather and Martinez said he would move down all the way down to 155 and fight him in the catchweight, and he never did it. And I always wanted Mayweather to step up and fight Sergio Martinez, but he wasn't going to take that risk. But he would have taken the risk with the lineal Cotto at 155.
And here's what I'll add to this. Remember, I said I'm going to come back full circle with Lara. In this hypothetical world, Lara was the dude at 154, which I do believe he would have been, right? He would have had a good resume, much better at this point. And I think he would have been the one, because remember, when Triple G was saying, oh, I'll fight anybody from 154 to 168, if you remember, Lara was raising his hand. And so was Andre Ward saying, oh, I'll fight you, right? I think Lara would have been the guy that would. It's not the same as Canelo doing it, but still, Lara would have been the guy that would have given Triple G like the fight. You know what I mean? Lara would have fought him, and I think it would just been like another HBO fight or something. But it would have been pay-per-view, nothing like that. And I think Triple G beats Lara, right? And that would be the end of Lara's run, by the way. But I do think that fight happens, and I think it's a pretty big fight, to be honest.
Now, shout out to one of the YTBC Ring IQ Boxing Talk. If Canelo never existed, Zurdo Ramirez would be the president of the PBC, and Munguia would be our last hope. And that's the interesting thing. If we look at who the face of boxing would be, the Mexican fan base that flocks to Canelo as not only the face of boxing, but the face of Mexican boxing,
right,
has to go somewhere, right?
For
and
sure.
It's not like they have to cheer for just one guy exclusively, but without Canelo, with that void, they need a face of Mexican boxing, and it would either be Zurdo or
Gallo,
Munguia.
I think it would have been Gallo or like something like that, but I mean, they're there for sure. You know what I mean? Now, I do want to say, people keep mentioning Chavez Jr., which he's definitely in the mix, right? Because he's the one that got the Canelo fight. I think it would have been Gennady Golovkin. I think Gennady, like after beating Lara, would have nowhere else to go. Mayweather's not going to fight Gennady Golovkin, right? Or I don't know if you agree with that. I don't know if a Gennady Golovkin Mayweather fight happens. So I mean that it's possible in this timeline, but I think Triple G moves up to 168, probably fights Chavez Jr. there, to be honest with you.
You think
and
so?
I think that's a bag for Triple G. I think he's like Chavez Jr. Sure,
maybe
he could always come back down. Yeah,
maybe as a one-off. Here's the thing about that. And Lil Penny, I believe in the comment section, put it earlier, is would Gennady Golovkin have been a Bernard Hopkins, Marvin Hagler type figure at middleweight? Because you got to remember, before he fought Danny Jacobs, he went on a run of 13 straight knockouts at middleweight. Knockout. I
forgot about Jacobs.
Consistently knocking guys out and consistently fighting.
That's a phenomenal point. I forgot about Jacobs.
Moves to Danny Jacobs, beats Danny Jacobs in a close decision. Without Canelo there, we get a rematch of that fight.
We probably get a trilogy,
Yeah, and then this middleweight run of Golovkin continues until maybe a one-off. He goes up and fights Chavez Jr., but then he drops back down.
Yeah.
There's not much there at 168.
Isn't that what Canelo did? Like, if somebody has to fill that void, right? I think it would have been Gennady Golovkin. I think Gennady moves up, beats the shit. I don't see it any other way. I think he beats the shit out of Chavez. I think Chavez quits on the stool in that fight, to be honest with you. But yeah, he moves back down, and I do agree that we would get at least a rematch, if not a trilogy, with him and Danny Jacobs. Okay, I think he beats Lara. I think he does a trilogy with Jacobs. I think he fights Chavez Jr. If anything, that's his bag. Not as big as a Canelo fight, but that's a bag. The thing is, does Mayweather fight Triple G?
No. Oh, no. God, no. That never
I
happens.
remember he said he's straight up and down, no special effects.
He wasn't willing to go to 155 to fight Sergio Martinez. In no way he would have ever entertained fighting Golovkin at any weight.
What if Golovkin comes down like to 155?
No, he wouldn't have.
Here's
another question. Would Gennady Golovkin be the face of Mexican boxing?
No.
No.
Well, no. I mean, like I think we could touch on that in a little bit. I just want to explore this. So it's kind of funny because at first I thought Triple G would fall into obscurity, but he really wouldn't. Because if you think about it, he would have. I think Lara would have fought him, right? And in this case, he would have fought Lara because he wouldn't have a lot of options. And then he would fight Jacobs, which he did, by the way. So before Canelo, there's no Canelo, so he would do the rematch. We might get a trilogy out of it. I think he's the one that gets to go up and beat the shit out of Chavez Jr. instead of Canelo, right? He would have filled that void. Mm-hmm. He probably comes back down, defends the belt again, but does Cotto fight him at any point? Like, are we going to give Cotto any benefit of the doubt, even after losing to Mayweather or something, to try to fight Gennady Golovkin?
And I'm a Cotto guy. You know that. No, he wasn't. Anytime he was asked about Gennady Golovkin, he would forget English. So that fight wasn't going to happen. The Mayweather fight wasn't going to be as much. Fight would have been Chavez Jr. We know Andre Ward was playing some games too. Andre Ward now says, I was willing to fight. No. That move to 175 for the Kovalev fight had already happened. The Carl Froch fight wasn't going to happen for Gennady Golovkin. Maybe we have to throw out that possibly if he's not waiting around for the big fight at middleweight, if that wasn't going to materialize, maybe he moves to 168 sooner. Maybe he corners Carl Froch into a fight in the UK. But
that almost happened.
And look, I'm a Carl Froch fan as well. And that fight, I don't think was going to happen. I don't think Carl Froch was ever going to fight Gennady Golovkin. So I think he would have had to have gone Gennady Golovkin on this middleweight run where he just continues to fight.
So do you think he has a loss, at least one loss against Jacobs? You think he You think he stays undefeated?
I think he stays undefeated. I think he beats Jacobs in both fights. After that, he goes and gets a money fight with Chavez Jr. The Cotto fight never develops for him.
So here's what we need to touch on. Let's not forget about the Charlo brothers, right? There's Jamal. There's Andrade. Okay. Now, in my example, Andrade's already kind of fought Lara, and in my opinion, he loses to Lara, but he's going to be there at 160. Does Triple G get those fights since there's no waiting around for a Canelo? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do those fights happen? Do we get a Jamal Gennady Golovkin and Andrade?
In this timeline we're talking about, let's say after the Danny Jacobs fight, maybe that happens 2017. Maybe the rematch happens early 2018. The Chavez Jr. fight develops shortly after that, maybe 2018. So in this timeline, the mandatories that Golovkin, that these guys wanted Golovkin to face, he would actually have to fight those fights, right?
Right.
We would get a Derevyanchenko fight at some point, but Bubu Andrade fight would likely have to happen if he's going to stick around in middleweight. Jamal Charlo likely has to happen if he's going to stick around at middleweight. He's not going to corner Chris Eubank Jr. because Chris Eubank Jr. is avoiding that fight as well. That doesn't change. So maybe he loses to a Bubu Andrade or Jamal Charlo. I don't think so, but that's a possibility. But those are the fights that he has to face if he's going to stick around at middleweight and do these fights. Or maybe he has to go over to PBC, and he's got PBC fights at 168 as well. But otherwise, he goes on this long run at middleweight, and to me, he's seen as a Bernard Hopkins, Marvin Hagler type figure, Gennady Golovkin, if Canelo's not around. More than anybody in the whole picture, this impacts Gennady Golovkin the most, and that makes sense, right? Because these are the two rivals. This is why we have this third fight this weekend, is these are the two rivals. These are the two guys the boxing gods have created for each other. So without Canelo in the picture, there's a void for Gennady Golovkin that needs to be filled with other fights.
Yeah.
And it impacts him significantly. Nobody is more excited that Canelo exists than Gennady Golovkin. He's not going to say it, but he does.
Of course not. But in this alternative timeline, though, is his career, like as far as resume wise, is looking really, really sweet. Like it really is. So like this Gennady, like remember, like Gennady was like he sold out Madison Square Garden, he sold out the Staples Center. We're talking East Coast, West Coast. This is a dude from Kazakhstan selling out to the West Coast and East Coast. So this was before the Canelo fight, and if that momentum train continued, he would only grow in popularity. In all honesty, beating Jacobs twice, beating Lara, in my opinion, beats Bubu Andrade. In my opinion, beats Jamal Charlo. A lot of Charlo fans are not going to like hearing that. They may disagree, but hey, in that timeline, we want to hear what people think. Let us know. Like, do you think Jamal would have gotten his big shot at one? I don't know. I just don't think Jamal beats him. I think he stays a little more active, to be honest with you. He's not waiting around for a Canelo fight. And I think that kind of keeps him polished and sharp. I think he's more active, obviously. But out of all those fights, though, I still think Jacobs would get a one win over him, to be honest. I think they would do a trilogy.
It was razor close.
Yeah, I think they would do a trilogy. I think Gennady wins the trilogy, but it doesn't really change our timeline step. Outside of having to do a trilogy, there's not much of a difference there as far as the way we see it, to be honest. The question is, because before we move on with the timeline, somebody brought it up, and that's why I like doing these. People bring up great points, right? Where's Golden Boy in all this? Right? Yeah. Somebody said they would go bankrupt. Golden Boy, if you remember when HBO fell, because HBO is still going to fall, and this is because HBO was bought out by AT&T that had nothing to do with boxing, or they merged with AT&T, whatever you want to call it. Time Warner did, and they wanted nothing to do with boxing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So HBO's gone. De La Hoya and Golden Boy used Canelo to leverage themselves into a DAZN deal, right? And Canelo gets this big deal. And Gennady Golovkin, I mean, hey, God bless him. He got a big deal out of it, too, because they thought they were going to get that fight. They eventually did, as we know, this upcoming Saturday. But where's Golden Boy in all this? Because they lost a huge stable of fighters. I think that scenario still happens. And it probably happened sooner without Canelo Calix. Mm-hmm. Like Al Heyman and Richard Schaefer probably jumped ship without Canelo around. They probably jumped ship way before. In this example, I think there's no more Golden Boy. Golden Boy Promotions is gone. There is no Golden Boy Promotions, Calix. Golden Boy Promotions.
Around what time? Around what year?
Well, because I'm talking just in general. Like as soon as the HBO deal is over,
it's done.
Once HBO is gone, Golden Boy. Well, let me rephrase it. I'm not saying they're gone, but I'm saying they're like Lou DiBella level or something. Like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They have a small stable of fighters, because even now they're loaning out fighters to Top Rank, so Top Rank could pay them right now. Right? We kind of know what would happen if Canelo left, because they were leveraging Canelo. They were using Canelo to leverage deals, and they were subsidizing the pay of their other fighters with Canelo. So knowing that, if it happened sooner, hey, you know what I mean? I'm just saying.
Another aspect, another angle we can go at with this is, do we have as many undisputed fights and unification fights the past 2 years if Canelo doesn't exist? Because we're going to move on with the timeline as far as these guys fighting each other at 160, 168.
I do believe that, and I'll tell you why. Because people are in the process of doing it before Canelo started doing it. You know what I mean? Crawford did it at 140, right? Crawford was the first in how many years, right? And then they were already talking about doing it with Crawford again at 147. Mm-hmm. Usyk did it a while back. Like, Usyk did it as a road warrior. Like, he didn't need the influence of Canelo. He did it himself. And we were already in 2015, we were talking about, hey, we want an undisputed heavyweight champion with Joshua and Wilder. And then we had an opportunity with Wilder and Ruiz, but there was a rematch clause, so they couldn't do it. And then when we had Fury Joshua, then it's saying we couldn't do it because of rematch clauses, right? And now we have an opportunity again. Usyk, Fury, right? So it's what we've been wanting for a while. So while Canelo contributed to it, he's not exactly the guy that made it a trend. I will say that.
Because not too many fighters have followed the trend of him fighting 3 times per year. Besides a few, maybe Bam Rodriguez, not too many guys have followed that Canelo trend. So that's a fair point. But how would it have changed the landscape 160, 168? Would these guys have fought each other more at 160, 168? Because that's been the big point
Man.
that we made the past year and a half.
I'm going to say something right now. I'm going to say something right now people don't want to hear, right? So who were the champions before Canelo even moved up at 168? It was Billy Joe Saunders. Mm-hmm. It was Callum Smith. It was David Benavidez. And it was Caleb Plant. Okay? Those were the champions. They weren't fighting each other.
Right.
And then the Reggie champion was Fielding. He was a Reggie guy, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think a lot happens because a lot wasn't happening before Canelo moved up to that division. You know what I mean? It just wasn't.
What I was going to make about the 160-pound division is I don't know how much would have changed because it's not like you being.
Well, here's the thing.
Besides the Golovkin picture.
Besides, right? but I would say even Jamal, because Jamal has been waiting, like them waiting on the big Canelo payday has been a big deal. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like waiting on that big payday changes everything because guys don't want to risk something because they're going to lose the payday. In this case, the payday would have been a Gennady Golovkin fight, especially if HBO's forking up the money, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that would have made them fight because their payday would have been that $1 million fight against Gennady Golovkin. It would have been a $10 million, right? But so they'll be more prone to take those risks, I believe. Okay, that's why I do believe Jamal would have fought Triple G, like that fight would have happened, right? And right now we would be talking about Jamal moving up to fight Triple G, probably, right? That would have been like a fight that we're talking about. But let me back up a little bit. First of all, Kovalev, as we know, obviously doesn't suffer that devastating knockout from Canelo. That doesn't happen, right? Mm-hmm. He beats Yard, and then I believe eventually either Bivol or Beterbiev or Vazhdek, one of those three, beats Kovalev. Okay, mm-hmm. I think that happens. I'm pretty confident either one of those three would have beat Kovalev. This version anyway, right? That's what happens with Kovalev. Aside from that, to be honest with you, everything at 175, since I believe either one of them would have beaten Kovalev, we're still looking at Bivol and Beterbiev as a top 175 pound. That's still a thing without Canelo.
His big win against Canelo.
Yeah, like that doesn't happen, but we already know he beat Sullivan Barrera, he beat Joe Smith, he already got to that place. And if you put him in there with Kovalev, I think he beats Kovalev. To be honest with you, I think Vazhdek beats him, or I think Beterbiev beats him. I think the Beterbiev-Vazhdek fight still happens. Obviously, we know what happened there. And I think right now, at the moment, we're still looking like at a Zurdo-Bivol fight, to be honest with you.
And it's probably bigger since Zurdo is possibly Mexican boxing.
That's a fair point. But I just wanted to touch on that because he did do that first, right? So we could pause that. Now let's go to 168.
Yeah, the zone 168.
I think since there's no Canelo fight and they were in the process of trying to milk everything. Now, I don't know how many people know this, okay? Because there's people out here spreading the lie that Canelo requested to fight what's the dude's name? The Turkish guy? Anvil or whatever. What's the dude's name? Yildirim. There you go. Yildirim. I forgot the dude's name, but Yildirim would have been in the mix. I know people don't want to hear that, but there's WBC articles where they're saying, "Oh yeah, Yildirim, he's going to get a shot against Benavidez. He earned it because he put up a great fight against." And there's quotes, bro. There's quotes from Samson saying, "Oh yeah, Yildirim deserves this. He's a warrior. He was winning. I believe he was doing really good, but then the head clash happened, and blah 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 blah." So that's what made Yildirim the mandatory. Mm-hmm. Okay, But Benavidez lost the belt on the scales.
Right.
So they have this mandatory. Canelo says, hey, I'll fight for the belt. I was a WBC champion at 160, right?
Yeah.
And people think he requested to fight Yildirim. No, he requested to fight for the belt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But in this case, that doesn't exist. But I do believe that COVID still happens, right? I believe Benavidez loses the belt on the scale still. That's what I believe happened. I think Yildirim probably fights Durrell for the vacant WBC belt. I think Durrell wins that fight. So Durrell wins his WBC belt back. All right.
Mm-hmm.
I think PBC does make Plant versus Durrell.
Earlier.
I think, Plant beats Durrell. He becomes a unified champion. I think Matchroom does make a Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders fight. I think Callum Smith wins that fight.
Really?
Yes. That's how I feel. But he's big for the weight. Callum Smith moves up to 175, and he's kind of in the same spot that he is right now. Okay. I think Billy Joe would have probably been a controversial decision. So he wins back his belt, right? So he's still a champion. And right now we sit with the Billy Joe Saunders, right? Mm-hmm. I think the Cuban kid wins he graduates from he graduates from Reggie champion to regular champion. So he's the WBA champion right now. Billy Joe is still the champion in his division. Callum Smith moves up. And Caleb Plant is sitting right now as a unified champion, right? As the white guy, that the only thing white about him is his white skin, right? So he sits right there, and we have this situation where they're not fighting each other because they're with PBC. The other is with Matchroom, and that's where we're sitting.
The 147 situation where guys just aren't, even with Canelo not there, guys aren't fighting each other.
Yeah, so that's the situation we have there, and I believe we could freeze it right there. I think that's where it is, and I think Benavidez is in the same spot at the moment, looking to fight Caleb Plant. Like he wants that Caleb Plant fight, and I think as of right now, we're sitting where we are because they were stalling the shit out of that fight, and they will still be stalling it, and maybe next year it happens or something like that. But as of right now, as we sit today, Caleb Plant is sitting as a unified champion. Due to many situations, he beats Yildirim for the WBC belt, Durrell, and then we got Billy Joe Saunders with the belt, and we got Callum Smith with moving up, and then the Cuban kid is a WBA champion. That's where we sit right now, with not much moving. To be honest with you, that's where we are. That's as much as far as I could go with that.
The two people it impacts the most at 168, obviously Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant. Both those guys suffered a loss, knockout loss, tough knockout losses to Canelo Alvarez, but they both got big bags that came along with it. 10 million, 8 million. I'm sure if you ask them, they'd rather the money than the undefeated record. I'm sure if you ask them.
Sure.
But we'd be looking at a Caleb Plant and I think an undefeated Billy Joe Saunders right now, and we'd be begging for unification fights. I think we'd have a situation which we're looking at 147 currently, where we have a ton of undefeated fighters. And it's amazing how this happens, right? The more you see PBC fighters in the division, the more gridlock you have in said division. And I think you'd have gridlock at 168 still. But Benavidez versus Plant may have happened this year.
Maybe, yeah. Okay.
Because Benavidez still looks good coming back from losing his belt on the scale. Maybe that fight would be next. And maybe Benavidez would be fighting Caleb Plant for 2 belts.
Who wins that fight?
Benavidez. Benavidez steamrolls Caleb Plant, in my opinion.
So Benavidez is back on. Okay, and he's got 2 of the belts?
2 of the belts, yeah. 2 of the belts.
Okay.
So Benavidez then has 2 of the belts. I'm not sure if the Billy Joe Saunders happens. I'm not sure if we can get undisputed at 168 without Canelo in it. Had Canelo not been at 168, I don't think we see it at 168.
What do you think the public, in your timeline, what do you think the public perception of a Billy Joe Saunders Benavidez fight is? And do you think Billy Joe does fight Callum Smith?
Well, yes, but you got to look at the perception of Billy Joe Saunders before the Canelo fight. Now, think about Billy Joe Saunders and how people perceived him when Canelo Alvarez was at 160. When people would throw out a mythical situation in which Canelo would move up to 168 and fight Billy Joe Saunders, a lot of people were picking Billy Joe Saunders to win that fight. The theory was lateral movement. Billy Joe Saunders is a guy. Remember him fighting Lemieux and then looking in the crowd after he makes a miss?
Right.
He was a slick boxer, great boxer. So I think Billy Joe Saunders would be seen right now, if Canelo's not in the picture, as I think he beats Callum Smith. I think that fight happens and he beats him. And he's sitting right now in the division seen as either number 1 or number 2. Caleb Plant maybe number 1. Billy Joe Saunders maybe number 2. And Benavidez is looking at it number 3 right now. People are saying Benavidez, the most talented guy in the division, but he's without a belt that he lost on the scale. And we can't give him number 1 because he doesn't have the belt. That's how we'd be looking at 168.
So let's extend it a little further, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going by your timeline. Gennady Golovkin's undefeated in your timeline right now. Is there any talk about? Yeah, is there any talk about him moving up to fight one of these guys, Billy Joe or Benavidez? Is that like a big fight people are talking about, or is Gennady Golovkin kind of like a Bernard Hopkins with Trinidad and De La Hoya? He's kind of looking for these guys to move up to fight him and challenge him for the middleweight belt. Like, where do you think he is right now?
In my timeline, it's tough to say because let's say a Danny Jacobs 2 fights happens. He wins both fights. It's tough to say if he will win those fights, but let's say he does. And then let's say he moves on and fights Chavez Jr. And then I think he has to fight the mandatories at 160 at that point. Boo Boo Andre, Jamal Charlo. He's already fought those 2 guys. Let's say he's still undefeated. At that point, what else is there? He's not going to fight Yanebek. He's not going to fight Eubank Jr. because Eubank Jr. doesn't want to fight him. There's nothing left there. He's got to move up to 168. And at that point, I think he's got to be with PBC at this point if he wants to fight, right? And if he's not going to get the fights at 168. And the fight at 168 with PBC would likely be Caleb Plant, right? It would likely be Caleb Plant.
So
unless he's not with the PBC and he goes overseas. But Billy Joe Saunders isn't going to fight him. He's not going to fight him.
Are you going by the quote he gave Eubanks? Like he could beat you and me the same night. Like remember that? Yeah. I do think the fight.
Fight him. Ward wasn't going to fight him. Despite the revisionist history, that fight, they weren't going to be able to make that happen. Eubank Jr. is not going to fight him. Cotto wasn't going to fight him. So he's still not getting those big fights. But Danny Jacobs is his big fight at 160. Multiple fights. Then he fights Chavez Jr.
But like right now, he would have already, like in your timeline, he would have already kind of came out on top, right? So
I think he'd have to be at 168 right now.
Yeah.
He'd have to be with PBC, and it would be either Caleb Plant or Benavidez.
Okay. I mean, what I think happens, I think Gennady Golovkin right now is the king of 160 in the year 2022. And I think there's big talks about on Errol Spence moving up to fight him. I still think the Kell Brook fight happens. I don't think that changes. I think that still happens for whatever stupid reason. Kell Brook wanted to fight him at 160. I still think that happens, right? But I think there's a lot of talks about these guys moving up because I do think that would happen. A Jermell fight with Triple G would be the big talk right now, right? That's kind of how I see it.
Maybe, so you're saying maybe Golovkin can unify all the belts and become undisputed at 160, and he's fighting the undisputed champion from 154?
Probably does become undisputed. Like, given the guys we named and who he beats, yeah, I think he becomes. Now, the thing is, because it's funny you mentioned PBC, because
if he's with Matchroom,
if he fights Jamal, right? If he fights Jamal, then in your timeline, then the Benavidez fight is possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. And he would have fought those by now. Those mandatories would have happened, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But maybe not. Maybe not, because if we look at, let me get this down. D-Style will be back in a minute. If we look at 160, maybe, just maybe, Golovkin is on the same timeline. Maybe he beats Danny Jacobs 2017, fights him again 2017. Maybe there's a trilogy there, but Derevinchenko fight still happens. Chavez Jr. fight, I think, happens at some point because that's got to be his money grab. He's got to have a money grab fight. But that takes us all the way to 2019. So in 2019, Gennady Golovkin wasn't very active. If Canelo isn't there and he doesn't already get his bag, is Gennady Golovkin more active in 2019? If so, he has to take fights like Bubu Andrade. He's got to take fights like Jamal Charlo in 2019, 2020 in order to keep himself active and do meaningful things in the division. And these guys on this timeline, these guys were asking for the Gennady Golovkin fight. Let's see if they would have, in this scenario, maybe they wouldn't have lived up to that. Maybe not. But the interesting thing here is COVID still hits, obviously, in 2020. So Gennady Golovkin from 2020 through 2021 wasn't very active until the Murata fight. Murata unification, does that happen? Does the Murata unification happen in 2020, 2022? Does that fight happen?
No, because Murata would have never climbed to that level because I think he would have had an iron grip on the division. I think some of the guys we mentioned that he would fight and beat would have like Murata would have been filtered out in that system. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Like whether it's Jamal or Andrade, to somebody like that, like even Jacobs would have filtered itself out. Like Murata kind of benefited from the fact that there was a lot of gridlock in the division, and Gennady was kind of in the same boat as a Marquez, where he was kind of obsessed with this fight and he wanted it. So that's what contributed to the inactivity. But I think in this timeline, he would be more active, right? That's what I think happens, to be honest with you. But
that's what I was just mulling over. I think Gennady Golovkin is more active in 2019. Yeah. After COVID in 2021, I think he's a more active fighter since he hasn't already gotten his big payday, and he's not like the multitude of guys 160 and 168 who would have been waiting around for a payday, unfortunately. And as we're doing this exercise, what I'm noticing is the guys at 160, I think they would have fought each other and they would have figured things out. They would have been a little more active guys fighting each other. But at 168, I don't think it would have moved along as quick as I thought without Canelo in the picture.
I think
with the multitude of PBC fighters at 168,
it's actually easier, and maybe because it's more recent, so like there's less movement, obviously. But I think there's the same kind of scenario, right? Now, one does need to question, Calix, like, does Billy Joe even get the opportunity to go to 168? Like, does he get filtered out like Murata at 160? Sure. Yeah. Right? Like, we got to think about that. But I think he would have moved up. I think he would have, like, I think the Lemieux fight still happens. He kind of like, you know what I mean? Now, does he ever even have a belt in 160? That's another different thing we got to think about. But I think he ends up in 168. I think he gets a belt there still. I think he's a champion right now. And there's gridlock. The gridlock is at 168, not at 160. In other words, that's what changes. And the only thing I kind of disagree with you with, really, and it's not that big of a disagreement. I think as like Plant sits as a unified champion right now, and the Benavidez fight is happening like next year or something like that. You just think it would have happened sooner, which isn't crazy to think, but I think eventually Benavidez gets the belt. Like, that doesn't change. But we don't have – I think what we both agree on, there's no undisputed champion at 168.
I think Al would have wanted Benavidez to get those belts back. More marketable guy. Yeah. Right now, the difference there is Al wants to save Benavidez. He doesn't want to put him in any risk and ruin a possible huge fight, humongous fight with Canelo Alvarez. So he would have been more aggressive with Benavidez, in my opinion, at this point.
Maybe you're right, but then there's also that Caleb Plant. Is he marketable? I think Al always thought he was marketable, right? Because he talks and he's a talking dude. He's from Nashville. And it taps into a fan base that boxing doesn't really get, right? Like in the South, boxing used to be big in the South, but That's where Big George is from, and Ali was from Kentucky, and you know what I mean. Like a lot of great fighters from the South, Roy Jones, Pensacola, but for some reason, it's lost a lot of popularity, right? But I think that's what he thinks is there with Caleb Plant. Like, it's from Tennessee. I mean, maybe we get a fan base that we don't really have. With Benavidez, obviously, there's a Mexican fan base. I still think they would be trying to milk the fight. Yeah. If anything, I was trying to get Benavidez to fight like a Billy Joe Saunders, like if anything.
Now, here's the big question. Would we be in a spot where, when we look at this, would boxing be in a better place without Canelo than it is right now? That's the big question. And to me, it's an easy question to answer. Definitively no. One thing that always sticks out to me is coming out of COVID, how the first big event in boxing, huge event, was Canelo, 73,000 at Jerry's World. He sort of ushered boxing out of that, right? There were other fights, but this was a huge one. And it was the first huge one, one of the first huge events, 73,000. This is what Canelo brings to the table, fighting 3 times that year, fighting 4 times in 11 months. Going for undisputed at 168, wheeling and dealing, making things happen. Big contracts with DAZN, big contracts with Matchroom. Just making an ungodly amount of money and generating an ungodly amount of money. The only way you can make that money is if you're actually generating it. So without him in it, I don't see how boxing is in a better place. I don't know how somebody can come up with that this sport can be in a better place without Canelo. The face of boxing would definitively be Anthony Joshua, a non-American. The face of Mexican boxing, to me, would be either Zordo or Munguia. That would be the big change here. I mean, how do you see this?
Man. So it would take, after everything we talked about, if you take Canelo out of the equation, and it's crazy because, like, and I want people to be honest, whatever you guys feel, I want people that don't like Canelo to comment on this. Like, I'm interested, I'm curious, right? Because there's some people that I've heard them, like I hear them loud and clear. They say he's bad for the sport, he's a cancer to the sport. I've heard, so maybe they do feel, and I want to hear from them. Like, do you think the sport is in a better place? But in my opinion, boxing is not in a better place. I think there would be a big void. Let me do this though. Let me say the pros and the cons. Mm-hmm. Now the con outweighs the pros, but in fairness, here are the pros though. In fairness, there's less gridlock at 160. We get more fights at 160. I think Jamal, Andrade, all these guys that are waiting for this big Canelo sweepstakes aren't waiting around because the sweepstakes in this scenario, at least in my timeline and yours, is Triple G. And I think those fights happen. And I think as a fight fan, just in general, even though we don't get Canelo Triple G, which were 2 great fights, the alternative is all these fights we get, like a Triple G. In my timeline, we get a Triple G Lara fight, we get a Triple G trilogy with Jacobs. He fights Andrade, he fights Jamal. We're getting ready to watch a Jamal fight. Like that in my timeline, that's what we have, right? And I think as a purist, man, that's great. That's a lot of fights. You know what I mean? That's a lot of action. At 160, we do get some of the fights. We get, like in my timeline anyway, we get Billy Joe versus Callum Smith. We're getting closer to a Plant Benavidez fight, which we all kind of wanted for a while. It didn't happen, but we're close to that. So those are some of the pros, right? So I want to throw that out there. The cons. You don't have Saul Canelo. You don't have 73,000 at AT&T Stadium. You don't have that Canelo weekend, which is a big fight weekend where everybody's watching. Even the dudes that say they don't like Canelo and like they're watching. You know what I mean? Like they're clearly watching the events. They have all these opinions about it. You don't have like a Canelo fight isn't just it's an event.
What does the zone look like What is
Yeah,
Eddie Hearn's presence
yeah,
in
yeah.
boxing?
Like I don't think the zone really has the confidence to be spending the money they're spending. A lot of these guys don't. Mikey Garcia doesn't get a $7 million payday because they don't have a Canelo to help launch their ship, right? Gennady Golovkin doesn't get a $20 million payday to fight like a dude that everybody knew was going to destroy. That doesn't happen. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's no. I'm not saying there's no the zone and they're not doing boxing, but there's no big paydays being thrown out. A lot of these guys, Caleb Plant doesn't get a life-changing payday of $10 million. Billy Joe Saunders doesn't get a life-changing payday of $10 million. Charles never even offered the $7 million he was offered, much less ever get it. Okay. Not that he got it today, but it is what it is. Yildirim never fights for $3 million against fucking Canelo. A lot of these guys, Law doesn't get his payday. Trout doesn't get his payday. None of these guys get these life-changing paydays to fight Saul Canelo Alvarez. Floyd Mayweather Jr. doesn't have that fight that helps him break the record that he had with Oscar De La Hoya, right? Mm-hmm. That fight doesn't happen. That event doesn't happen. Floyd Mayweather doesn't have that win that's aging great. That doesn't happen. I think I'm going to say this, like, I agree with you that Joshua would be the phase, right? But as far as non-heavyweights, there is no phase. It's a standard. There's no paper. There's no 2 over 1 million buy pay-per-views that him and Gennady Golovkin did. Like,
it would have been the first time that's happened, right? Because I feel like you've had multiple stars in each generation. You've always had at least multiple stars to where if this guy disappeared, you have another guy. If Pacquiao disappeared, you still have Mayweather. If De La Hoya disappeared, then it would be tough because De La Hoya introduced Mayweather and Pacquiao to the market, but you still had other guys who can generate a ton of revenue even without De La Hoya, right? In other generations, this is the first one where I feel like if this guy went away, and that's why it's important to do this exercise, if this guy went away, it would be a hit because every positive, every pro that you named is very much on a micro level. On a macro level, there is no good point, in my opinion. There's no fair point as to it would be better off without this guy in the picture.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal point. I do think there's a lot of the positives I gave were micros, right, for the most part, and it's kind of benefits like the hardcores, like a couple more Saturday nights with some good fights. You know what I mean? But at the macro level. Right, and I'm going to get a little humorous in a little bit, but before I get there, Canelo Alvarez is a money generator for boxing. Like that cannot be argued. Like he goes to Dallas, the home state, or I'm sorry, the home state. I'm sorry, the home city of Spence. Spence can do 70,000 in Dallas. That's not even Canelo's not even from Dallas. Like Spence does good numbers in Dallas, but not 70,000. Not $9 million at the gate. Like nobody does those numbers.
Spence either because Spence did 38, and Spence isn't alone in that. Canelo could go to Omaha and do better than Terrence Crawford.
Omaha. Shout out to Peyton Manning.
Yeah. Canelo can go to the UK and do better than a lot of those fighters, if not all of them.
But here's what I'm saying is, and I think this is more of a philosophical question. Like, is someone destined to fill that void if that person doesn't exist? I'm going to argue that no. There are no givens in life. I don't believe that boxing is just destined, right, to have somebody to fill a void. If there's nobody to fill a void, then there's nobody to fill a void. And I don't think there's anybody to fill the void. Outside of heavyweight division would be exactly the same as we see today, right? That wouldn't change. All the smaller weight classes, Chocolatito will still have his amazing run. None of that would change. But as far as from 154 to 168, even 175, I did mention, it would kind of be the same, to be honest. Yeah. Like, I do feel that way. But 168, 160, 154 will be so different for the most part. I think it will filter out, and we will still see Jermell on top at 154. We would still see, like, Triple G would be the dude. But as much of a legend as Bernard Hopkins was, he didn't move a needle. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
He wasn't a needle mover. And so there would be a big void to fill, right? Like there would be a void missing. Like I just don't think from a cultural level and like you said, at a macro level, there's anything that would fill that missing void. Now you can't just replace a guy that can do like it's not just sheer numbers, it's the gate. $9 million at the gate in Dallas. Like not just anybody could do that. Like
18
over
million,
18 million,
for
20
total
something million, like at the gate. We wouldn't be seeing those numbers. And when a Canelo has a fight and a big event and everybody's excited about it, that does something to against the people that say boxing's dying. There's no more stars. We could point at a Canelo and say, no, he's a star. Look at what he's making. Look at what he's generating. Look at the people that show up to his fights. That is powerful. And I think boxing fans lose sight of that. They lose sight of what this guy does for the sport, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody would have filled that void as much as on paper, Triple G, without a doubt, would have had a phenomenal career. And he would be an asset to boxing, but he wouldn't make up for that missing void, in my opinion. As far as who's the face of Mexican boxing, I would argue that there would be more attention on Gallo Estrada. I think there would be more attention on him. But whether we like it or not, Calix, whether we like it or not,
yeah,
the little guys, they just don't. It's unfair, but they just don't generate attention like that.
I think it would have been Gordo, and then Munguia would definitely be building a lot of momentum right now. Definitely.
Yeah.
And he still is, but even more so.
I think there would be a missing void. And if I had to give a verdict, I would say that while there's pros and cons, like I said, for the most part, overwhelmingly, the sport's not in a better place.
Oh, yeah. The sport is in a much better place with Canelo existing than not existing. And what I'd also say is I've always felt this. I've always felt that the recycling process naturally happens, right? We're going to get a face of boxing. We're always going to have a face of boxing, but it becomes more difficult when the numbers are the way they are right now, when guys are fighting once per year and those organic fan bases aren't being built anymore. Everything seems to be manufactured. So I think it's going to be harder to come by now, where in the past you've had multiple faces of boxing. So where if that guy disappeared, you still have that guy behind him, that guy behind him. Now, besides Canelo and AJ, you don't have a true superstar, I should say, in boxing who transcends the sport. It's Canelo and AJ, clear front runners, and everybody is far behind them. And you're taking Canelo out the picture. And that's tough to say, to where it's an indictment on the sport, to where if you take this one guy away, it changes the picture of boxing that much. And I tend to think that 5 years from now, when Canelo starts his exit process, is likely going to be around 5 years from now. I think
if we're lucky,
somebody's face will show, and somebody will be able to take that baton and say, I'm the face. Now, hopefully that happens, because you have some American talent coming up. Hopefully they get their superstardom, but the process has to be, these guys got to get more active. They have to get more active. And Canelo's trying to show these guys that. He's only had 1 year in his whole career where he hasn't fought more than one time, and that's 2020. That was a COVID year. Otherwise, every single year he would have been a full-time fighter. These other fighters, once a year. I wouldn't have thought I'd care about this fight, but I think this is more about story than anything, and you guys know I love that. Here's a beer. Appreciate you writing, Yogi. Appreciate that super chat. And yeah, this fight this weekend is very much about the rivalry. It's very much about storylines on top of everything else that comes along with it. All the belts, ring belt as well, Jaguar Warrior belt as well. And that's another thing. If Canelo doesn't exist, we don't have the Jaguar Warrior belt, D-Style. We don't have some of these belts that they've created to hand to Canelo. But I don't know, your final thoughts really on Canelo Alvarez and what he's brought to the sport.
Well, I wanted to touch on one more thing.
Good.
As far as how this would impact Floyd Mayweather, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do think, like in my timeline anyway, and I think it was kind of in your timeline too. If that Cotto fight with Mayweather happens for the lineal championship, and Mayweather would have been a 6th division champion, he would have been one of the few fighters to go from lightweight to middleweight, right? I think, believe it or not, and a lot of people might disagree with me on this because the Canelo wins big, but at least on paper, that would enhance Mayweather's career more. Like people might disagree with that, but I think beating Cotto, who was a lineal champion, of course, we know it would have been a rematch and all that, but still,
I would disagree with that.
You know, but I think it on paper it would enhance his career more because he would have been a 5-division champion. He could say, I was a champion from lightweight all the way to middleweight. And like not a lot of guys could say that. Like there's De La Hoya, there's other guys, but like to go from 130 to and it would on paper anyway, it would be a bigger deal than even De La Hoya because De La Hoya won his middleweight belt in a very controversial fashion against Sturm that people didn't even think he wanted to fight, and it's nowhere near as big of a name as Cotto, right? Yeah. So in my timeline, I think it would have enhanced his career a little more, right? That's just my opinion. And you could touch. I know you said you disagree, and I definitely want you to touch on that. But with that said, I think the verdict's clear. I think boxing is better. And if anybody disagrees, I want to hear it. Like in all seriousness, I'm not even saying like I'm gonna shred anybody or I don't want to argue with anyone. I want people's honest opinion. Like, do you think boxing would be better without Canelo in it? And if you do believe that, we want to hear your opinions on it. You know what I mean? I would even invite guys if you want to do a quick live as a response, old school style, and kind of talk about it or something. You know what I mean? And I'll even share it if you do. You know, but I just want to whether you agree or disagree. I want to know how you feel if boxing will be in a better place, worse place, or whatever it is. But we want to open this discussion to everybody. But I think some guys would have benefited from it, though. I think Lara's career is enhanced, at least on paper, and so would Gennady Golovkin's, to be honest with you. So that's what I got to say.
I'm going to tend to disagree with that as well. And first of all, as you said, most people will be watching this in the archives, so make sure to leave comments below on all of this, agree or disagree. The part I disagree with first is Mayweather. Yes, huge accomplishment becoming middleweight champion, and that looks great. It does. But I tend to think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that Canelo victory will continue to age great for Mayweather because, in my opinion, it's the greatest win of his career if you put it into proper perspective. How he fought, how he schooled Canelo in that fight. I think that fight will continue to age well as time goes on. And as Canelo's legacy continues to build, that win will be even bigger than winning a middleweight title against Miguel Cotto. I just think that.
Well, let me ask you this really quick. Do you think when you say it, like, because that I do agree with. So I'm going by like right now, like September 14th, like 2022. As of right now, I feel that win would have been better. But I do agree with you that in time, like if we look 20 years down the line, that win will be. I do agree with that.
Yeah. And also the same thing with Golovkin. And yes, I mean, an undefeated Golovkin right now being more attached to Bernard Hopkins and Marvin Hagler than he is now, big deal. But also being attached to a legend the way he is now, a future legend. As time goes on, that will be appreciated more. I think when people study Gennady Golovkin's resume 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when he's in the Hall of Fame and everything's said and done, and they see the fights he had to fight because the other fights weren't coming to him, and that he was attached to Canelo Alvarez, who is a legend in the sport, especially how we'll be viewed 15, 20 years from now, because Canelo's legacy, I think, will build bigger and bigger as time goes on. Given the way he's fought in this current climate of boxing, where you have inactive fighters not fighting great competition consistently, and Canelo has bucked that trend. I think him being more of a throwback fighter will grow a legacy. And let me get to this super chat real quick before you touch on one last point. Much respect, Calix Boxing 2.0 in the chat. Stopped in to show support. Hit the like button. Salute. Just got off work.
Shout out to Tony.
We always appreciate you, man.
Hey, by the way, shout out to Tony. Shout out to Riding Yogi. Everybody supporting, man.
Yep.
We appreciate it.
But hit on one last point. I know you got.
It's just funny. So,
and also before you click on that real
Sure.
quick, Virgil Ortiz. Somebody put his name in there. That's an interesting name. Who would have likely gotten more shine without Canelo, and he's a guy that we have to throw in the cooker as a possible guy who can take over as face of the boxing.
I think you don't think he's in the same spot. I think he's like in the same spot at the moment. That's how I feel.
Possibly, but what I'm saying is he's possibly a guy who can take that torch and run with it. As a possible face of boxing. I
just want to say this because I was saying, and I forgot to make this point. Because he's like, I was saying about kind of being a cash cow and how he generates money. Boxing ego, and a lot of these dudes wouldn't have a lot of content, bro. Yeah. Like they wouldn't have a lot to talk about. They wouldn't really. Maybe Gennady Golovkin would have been their target, maybe, but they wouldn't have a lot. Target. They wouldn't have somebody they could just talk about, leech onto, and just be the anti that guy and generate money off of it, right? I just don't think that they wouldn't have that. Like I think they won't admit it, but those anti Canelo videos generate them a lot of money. All right, so it is what it is.
Canelo is definitely great for content creation, especially for his haters. I'm sure it gets them a lot of super chats and AdSense money and all that good stuff. So if we're looking at macro level things, to me, it's a wipeout. To me, it's all positive Canelo being in the sport. And I don't see how anybody can say otherwise, other than some micro points. He's positive for the sport overwhelmingly. So D-Style Boxing, where we at tomorrow night?
Yo, everybody, make sure you tune in to the round table. Okay, we're going to be on live tomorrow, okay, on my channel, D-Style Boxing. We have a loaded channel. We have Lady Chan. We have Sasha from Women's Boxing Fight News. I just got news right now. Sutter Kane's going to be on. Mario Munguia. We got my bro, Cali X, by the way, okay. We got, I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. Obviously, Joe Habib, obviously, but we have a loaded panel. It's going to be a fun panel, and I know I'm forgetting somebody, but I'm sorry, but it's going to be a loaded panel, and I can't wait, man. Like I am excited for this one.
It should be a big one. It should be one of the best ones. We got a big fight coming up in a few days. We're just 3 days away now. Appreciate y'all coming through. Continue to enjoy the content. We continue to enjoy you having y'all come to the comment section, and y'all in the archives as well. Hit that like button and comment below.
And really quick, if you have any suggestions for a future pass, drop it in the comments.
Drop it in the comment section below. On that note, we out. Good night. Peace.